Hey everyone, this is an article from the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School of Critical Theory by Christoph Hesse. The article is titled Leo Löwenthal, Last Man Standing. I guess you could call it a chapter as well. So here we go. His most unlikely name is probably his most enduring legacy. Skimming through the legendary history of the Frankfurt School for Social Research, especially the years in American exile, one will quickly come across him, Leo Löwenthal, or Löwenthal as he used to spell his name, in English language publications. Was then Max Horkheimer's closest associate, next to, of course, Friedrich Pollock, an intimate friend of yore, with whom Horkheimer shared virtually all his thoughts and decisions. He officiated as the managing editor of the Institute's journal Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, and later, as it were, rather unwillingly, as the housekeeper of its remaining branch in New York when his colleagues moved to California in the early 1940s. Löwenthal's contribution to the maintenance of the Institute in its hardest times, when he, along with Horkheimer, sought to keep up the material conditions for the persistence of what has since been termed, quote, critical theory, may scarcely be overestimated. Löwenthal's own scholarly works, however, in large part went widely unnoticed, at least by comparison with those of his celebrated colleagues. His pioneering inquiries into the sociology of literature, his formerly renowned studies on the historical formation of popular culture, as well as on authoritarianism and anti-Semitism, have all withered on the vine for decades now, neatly canonized, but seldom read anymore. Even among those familiar with and still genuinely interested in critical theory, the writings of Löwenthal are rather unknown. Compared to his friends, most notably Theodor W. Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, Löwenthal never rose to intellectual stardom, nor did he win overwhelming public acclaim on the part of the protest movements that emerged across Western Europe and North America in the 1960s. Lacking both Adorno's aesthetic aura and Marcuse's radical, or as some say, even erotic appeal, his unpretentious and rather cautious, almost gentle style of writing was not supposed to attract an audience craving idols to look up to, albeit he is said to have been the most approachable and amiable of them all. While Adorno delivered hundreds of lectures on West German radio stations throughout the 1950s and 1960s, and Marcuse, beyond belief today, was a best-selling author who spoke to enthusiastic crowds of politicized students at meetings and sit-ins in both West Germany and the United States. Löwenthal kept to the sidelines. As early as 1931, Adorno teasingly called him the, quote, king of the desert roaming his territory, end quote. Yet he stood his ground when it was most desperately needed. For instance, when the Nazis assumed power in Germany, he remained in the country a while longer than his colleagues, taking measures to ensure the Institute's survival in exile. Later, when Horkheimer, now intellectually associated mostly with Adorno, returned to Frankfurt in 1949 on an invitation to re-establish the Institute for Social Research, Löwenthal was left behind. Yet this time it was meant to be forever. While the Frankfurt School, as it came to be nicknamed by the 1960s, soon earned some measure of fame in West Germany and abroad, Löwenthal remained almost invisible, at least in Europe, involuntarily distanced from his old friends whom he only seldom met, except for Marcuse, who deliberately decided not to relocate to post-Nazi Germany. Löwenthal pursued his own course as a solitary, quote, Frankfurter in American academia. It was only in the 1980s that Löwenthal, by then the last member of Horkheimer's former circle still alive, came to the fore in Germany. Helmut Dubiel edited a 5-volume collection of Löwenthal's writings comprising early academic works and contributions to the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, as well as subsequent American publications, many of which had not been easily available in Europe before. Maybe even more important for his public perception, Dubiel published a series of interviews in which Löwenthal recollects his intellectual and political biography, thereby revealing as much about his own unexpectedly turbulent life as of the history of the Institute that had decisively shaped his way of thinking. Quite recently, a new book about Löwenthal was published, one of the very few monographs on Löwenthal. The title reads, in English translation, No Critical Theory Without Leo Löwenthal. Yet, as true as this may be, with particular regard to his managerial functions, the well-meaning and also somewhat boastful title unwittingly reflects the oblivion into which Löwenthal's work has fallen, most obviously in the United States, where he had once established himself as a sociologist and as an outstanding erudite scholar of European literature and philosophy. As distinct from Adorno and even more so from Horkheimer, who very reluctantly revealed any details about the shrouded history of the Institute, Löwenthal held no reservations about his outright Marxist past, which he had never really moved away from. All the same, the critical theory that he passionately advocated throughout his life has been largely supplanted by a variety of self-professed critical studies, most of which, curiously enough, sprang from the post or sometimes blatantly anti-modernist line of thought he had warned against. Almost tragically, it was Löwenthal's unstinting commitment to the Institute, a commitment verging on self-abandonment at times, that hampered his own theoretical production. On the 3rd of October 1947, Horkheimer wrote to him in English, quote, "The fact that for a number of years you have not written an article or a book which is an adequate expression of the stage of our theoretical insight is due to the practical situation and to the setup into which we are forced for the sake of our survival," end quote. Horkheimer. The circumstances of those decades were adverse in the extreme. While Marx, back in his anything but happy days, could realistically bank on an increasing working class movement, the likes of Horkheimer and Löwenthal had no social forces to rely on, not even virtually. In the face of Nazism and fascism on the one hand, and the dreadfully miscarried trajectory of the Bolshevik Revolution on the other, which had developed into a rule of sheer terror, an unflinching critical theory of society found itself redirected to what the young Marx called the, quote, "ruthless criticism of all that exists," end quote. Marx. With hindsight, Löwenthal said, quote, "We had not abandoned praxis, rather praxis had abandoned us," end quote. Therefore, if there was no revolutionary subject to hope for, it was up to those otherwise powerless intellectuals not only to produce and maintain theoretical insights, but to anticipate also practically at least a few elements of a humanity that might never really come into being. Quote, "Moreover," Horkheimer added, quote, "it has always been our conviction that the development of our conceptions does not exclusively express itself in theoretical writings, but in the conduct of our lives. There must be an interaction between existence and theory as it is exemplified in our own history," end quote. Horkheimer. This rule of etiquette, if that is what it can be called, was probably best exemplified by Löwenthal. At the end of his conversations with Helmut Dubiel, he revealed, quote, "Of course my heart beats faster when the utopian seems to throw off sparks, if only for a moment, but disappointment follows all too quickly. Just take a look at the world today. Tell me just where should one plant one's political sympathies and hopes," end quote. What he knew for certain, though, was that any admission of regression, for example, of romanticizing of pre-modern or supposedly more authentic cultures, would offer no way out. Quote, "You can't turn back history," end quote. In his early years, he had already described the life of Freud as a constant struggle to gain both insights and people sharing these insights. The same might be said of Löwenthal himself. His most significant insights will be discussed here. First, Löwenthal's contributions to the perception of art and culture, particularly his sociological, meaning historical materialist approach to literature. Second, his notion of mass communication and popular culture, what might offer a deeper historical understanding of what Adorno and Horkheimer notoriously termed the culture industry. Third, his empirically based theoretical studies on authoritarianism and anti-Semitism. Finally, his critical remarks on the emerging postmodernism in the humanities and social sciences. Before that, a quick biographical sketch to supplement what has been said above. Born into a middle-class family in Frankfurt in 1900, Löwenthal was shaken by the horrors of the First World War, leading to his engagement in both socialism and Zionism. During his university studies, he taught classes at a Jewish center for adult education along with Erich Fromm. He was also involved in a relief agency for Eastern Jewish refugees. Löwenthal earned his PhD with a thesis on the social philosophy of Franz von Baader, a widely unknown early 19th century Catholic philosopher. Through his friend Siegfried Krakauer, Löwenthal then joined the newly founded Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, initially as an unsalaried associate. His attempt to qualify as a professor with a treatise on Helvetius and the French Enlightenment failed, so Löwenthal taught German literature at high school level until he became a full member of the Institute in 1930, with Horkheimer as its new director. The social history of literature was the field of study Löwenthal had been entrusted with upon his entry into the Institute in 1926. Löwenthal went on to explore it throughout the years of exile and beyond. In the early 1940s, alongside Marcuse, he worked for the Office of War Information, not only to make a living, but also to support the United States' defeat of Nazi Germany. By the end of the war, he had taken a growing interest in the development of popular culture. In 1949, when Horkheimer and Adorno relocated to Frankfurt, Löwenthal was appointed as research director of Voice of America. Unlike Marcuse, he would have appreciated an opportunity to go back, but Horkheimer was not able to ensure another academic position in Germany. In 1956, after a period of depression, when he had probably given up the idea of returning, he became a professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, where he lived until his death in 1993. But this particular disciplinary denomination never meant much to him. At the most general level, he considered himself a philosopher. Quote, "You know my cynical remark," end quote, he told Helmut Dubiel, quote, that the division of the social sciences into different academic departments is just a means of limiting structural unemployment among intellectuals, end quote. Helmut Dubiel. Not Helmut Dubiel, Leo Löwenthal, excuse me. New section. Literature, Art, and Popular Culture. Löwenthal initially outlined the task of a historical materialist theory of literature in 1932. A heated debate on this issue was already in full swing, particularly among the ranks of the Union of Proletarian Revolutionary Writers, which was closely affiliated with the German Communist Party. Regardless of the shortcomings of its opposition between proletarian culture and bourgeois tradition, such an eminently political debate was not admitted into legitimate academic discourse in those days. Moreover, Löwenthal did not quarrel with the communist strategically motivated understanding of literature as a weapon, an understanding alien to art which he never shared. Instead, he sought to counter academic discourse from within, challenging both time-honored idealist and more recent positivist conceptions of literature. He insisted that a, quote, concern with the historical and sociological dimensions of literature requires a theory of history and society. That is not to say that one is limited to vague theorizing about the relationships between literature and society in general, nor that it is necessary to speak in generalities about social conditions which are required for the emergence of literature. Rather, the historical explanation of literature has to address the extent to which particular social structures find expression in individual literary works and what function these works perform in society, end quote. Leo Löwenthal. In other words, rather than providing general considerations on the relationship between literature and society or the social conditions that determine literature, the social dimensions of literature can only be demonstrated in detail by reference to a particular author and his or her work. Unsurprisingly, Löwenthal's approach to literature was met with some resistance by his associates at the Institute. Adorno was particularly suspicious of this, quote, historical sociological kind of work, end quote, leading him to confide to Benjamin that the Institute was unlikely to accept the Arcades project as long as Löwenthal made decisions on questions of literary history. Moreover, even if it was based on notions of historical materialism, Adorno suspected that a sociology of literature would tend to focus on the author as a social subject at the expense of his or her artistry, or at least underestimate the transcendent capacities of art. This informed a bizarre idea Adorno harbored, sending Löwenthal to Paris to apprentice with Benjamin. This simmering conflict came to a head in March 1941 when Adorno seized the occasion of an institute meeting to rebuke Löwenthal's emphasis on the writer, his position in the process of production and in society more generally. In contrast, Adorno argued in favor of the work of art itself, a product exempt from the constraints of production which transcends its creator's intentions and maybe even his cognitive capacities. It remains questionable to what extent Löwenthal's supposedly inadequate or insufficient methodological approach really impaired his numerous studies on the history of literature. Obviously, he was a little less interested in the form and the inner logic of a work of art than in its social meaning and reception. Löwenthal saw literary works as the most revealing documents of their epoch, including their missed historical opportunities. This is the case not only because of their manifest subject matter, but also because of their specific form, which he too, albeit in a manner less pronounced than Adorno, regarded as an expression or an unconscious inscription of social conditions. Quote, literature teaches us to understand the success or failure of the socialization of individuals in concrete historical moments and situations, end quote. One second. Leo Löwenthal. Despite their purported status as fiction, literary works thus provide insight into the experience of particular historical realities. This is because, unlike contemporary conditions, historical realities in the full sense of the word cannot be studied immediately. Thus, as Löwenthal stated, quote, great literature is the only reliable source, in my opinion, end quote, Löwenthal. This perhaps slightly exaggerated assessment resonates with Engels' remark about his understanding of French history on the basis of Balzac's Comédie Humaine. Roughly speaking, Löwenthal traced the development of two different paths of the literary depiction of society, a true and a false one, which occasionally overlapped and could be found in the same text. According to this simplified distinction, true refers to a genuine experience of social reality, whereas any kind of delusion that escapes reality or society is false. Both are incumbent upon the depiction of the individual struggle with the emergence of bourgeois society, which brought forth the individual as a social category and at the same time denies its demands for fulfillment. Regardless of whether Shakespeare and Goethe, Löwenthal's favorite classic authors, are realists of form and style, he considers them true witnesses of their times. Their works convey a vivid portrayal of exactly that struggle, or in other words, of the process of bourgeois civilizations, its promesse du bonheur, bonheur, I'm not sure how to say that, as well as its imminent failure. I guess it's promise of something. I don't know what that means. That's my guess, though. For instance, in Caliban, the antagonist of Prospero in Shakespeare's play The Tempest, Löwenthal discerned a prototype of the authoritarian personality, characteristic to modern mass communications and manipulations. Thus, a historically true work of art also transcends its time. German Romanticism, by contrast, offers an outstanding example of the false in its spiriting away from the emerging bourgeois society. Löwenthal called it a repressed revolution, or more precisely, quote, a revolution in a type of reality that exists only on the other side of social life, end quote. Like an adult imagining themselves in a fairy tale world, seeking their way either to nature or to a long bygone past, the romantics succumbed to regression, as Löwenthal put it in psychoanalytic terms. Social alienation was thereby transformed into a virtue, and the socially imposed isolation of the individual into a desired, quote, solitude in the woods, end quote. What Ludwig Tieck famously termed Waldeinsamkeit. While the reactionary elements of German Romanticism remained ambivalent, to say the least, the apparently romantic depictions of rural life in the novels of Knut Hamsun reflect the development of political consciousness from liberalism to the authoritarian state. From this point of view, Hamsun is depicted as a revenant of German Romanticism in late modern times, a reactionary in the most precise sense of the word. In their humble praise of down-to-earth life, with everyone rooted to his or her native soil, Hamsun's novels do not even portray living human beings, Löwenthal argued, but merely resentful attitudes towards urban civilization. Apart from the moods and landscapes they display so enticingly, the novels thus convey a false account of historical reality. Accordingly, Löwenthal was the first critic to frankly disclose Hamsun's sympathies for the Nazis, which eventually cast a shadow on his fame. Given his popularity in post-Wilhelmine years, his novels won the readers they deserved. Yet even a greater work than Hamsun's may, at least temporarily, fall prey to the dark desires of an unhoped-for audience, as Löwenthal demonstrated in his analysis of the German reception of Dostoevsky. It was on the question of public reception that Löwenthal in the mid-1930s gradually stepped away from the realm of Weltliteratur, world literature, to take a closer look at more popular readings. Parallel to Adorno's examination of jazz and radio listening, Löwenthal began to explore the reception of popular biographies. The latter, according to Löwenthal, personalize otherwise unfathomable, manifold, mediated social relations and thereby turn their protagonists into idols. They offer their readers what Löwenthal would subsequently call a, quote, vicarious experience, end quote, to him one of the most salient features of popular culture. A biography of a celebrity's life, stylized like that of a hero in the movies, invites readers to put themselves in his or her place, namely to experience virtually the significance of personal experience in an age of impersonality, in which individual thoughts or actions are largely absorbed by overpowering social forces and institutions. Perhaps due to his comparatively circumspect diction, Löwenthal has sometimes been considered more receptive to, that is, less critical of the promises and possibilities of popular culture than his friend Adorno, an estimate that Löwenthal himself forthrightly rejected. Quote, it is indeed in this era of popular culture, or as Adorno called it, quote, the culture industry, end quote, that our interests frequently converged, end quote. Löwenthal was probably less suspicious of the culture industry's technology, which he thought could be easily used for better purposes, but what certainly does distinguish his approach to popular culture, not only from that of Adorno, is his inquiry into the history of this seemingly ultra-modern phenomenon, which according to Löwenthal emerged in 18th century England with its blossoming journals and newspapers. Löwenthal, moreover, did not just look into the institutional development of media and culture, but also traced the evolving debate on it back to earlier modern times. To the surprise of many of his contemporaries, he found out, quote, that quite a few basic concepts which we have been accustomed to regard as very modern emerge as early as the 16th century. Distraction, entertainment, and last but not least, vicarious living, end quote. These concepts, which are used to describe the functions of modern popular culture, had been developed long before anything like it. Furthermore, Löwenthal did not discover them in England, but in France. The first to attest to these new experiences was the solitary writer Montaigne, the renowned pioneer of modern skepticism, who, by the way, also introduced a new literary genre, the essay. And it was Montaigne, Löwenthal wrote, who first, quote, took stock of the situation of the individual after the breakdown of medieval culture. He was particularly struck by the phenomenon of loneliness in a world without faith, in which tremendous pressures were being exerted on everyone under the conditions of a post-feudal society. To escape destruction by these pressures, to avoid becoming lost in the horrors of isolation, Montaigne suggested distraction as a way out, end quote. Löwenthal. About a century later, when bourgeois commercial culture had already developed to a considerable extent, and when, quote, the waning influence of religion, pre or post-Reformation, had made itself felt much more strongly in the average way of life, end quote, these moods and feelings described by Montaigne had spread further, as was evident in the work of Blaise Pascal, a mathematician and above all else a firm religious believer. Quote, restlessness, the search for relief everywhere and anywhere, had become a major social phenomenon. It was then that Pascal spoke up against the complete surrender of man to self-destroying restlessness, end quote. Löwenthal. As strictly opposed to Montaigne, Pascal, quote, warned against what he called, quote, diversion, end quote, as a way of life which could lead only to permanent unhappiness, end quote. Quote, thus, Löwenthal concludes, quote, the attitude toward leisure which for Montaigne guarantees survival means self-destruction to Pascal, and the controversy is still going on, end quote. Löwenthal. Today, Löwenthal suggests, we could easily imagine a, quote, benevolent analyst of a mass medium who seems to say that, while everything is not yet wonderful, it is getting better every day, end quote. And on the other hand, a, quote, nonconformist social critic who connects the loneliness of modern man with his interest in mass media as a setup of utter frustration, end quote. Löwenthal. However, the concepts introduced by Montaigne and Pascal noticeably changed with the ongoing development of art and popular culture. Montaigne, back in his century, made, quote, no clear-cut distinction between the psychological motives of artist and audience, end quote. Whereas Goethe, for example, more than 200 years later, saw, quote, the artist as the spokesman for the high standards of his, quote, trade, and the public in the passive role of consumers, end quote. Goethe, or I don't know if that's actually, I don't know who that quote is from. I guess that's Löwenthal. Löwenthal refers particularly to the, quote, prelude on the stage, end quote, in Goethe's Faust, which presents a dispute between the manager and the poet. Here, quote, when the poet resists the manager's exhortations, he does not do so in the name of religious or spiritual values, but in terms of the artist's mission, end quote. And this, Löwenthal points out, was only, quote, the beginning of the period which witnessed both the spread of popular newspapers and magazines and the unprecedented flowering of high literature, end quote. Löwenthal. It was in this period between the early 19th century that the antagonism between art and popular culture fully developed. Löwenthal points out two issues that have been discussed ever since. First, the problem of artistic standards, which is closely related to the question of the influence of public taste on the character of artistic or cultural products. Second, the problem of mediocre art. Goethe's friend Schiller early on, quote, recognized that as society became more mechanized, it made harsher demands on the life of the individual. These demands exhaust both mind and body, and man therefore requires rest and relaxation in his leisure time, end quote. Löwenthal. Beauty, according to Schiller, quote, addresses all the faculties of man and can only be appreciated if a man employs fully all his strength. He must bring to it an open sense, a broad heart, a spirit full of freshness, end quote. I'm not sure who that quote is from. I don't know if that's Schiller or Löwenthal. Whereas mediocre art would make no such demands, but rather suspend thought. Thereby Schiller, who unlike Goethe already possessed an idea of social classes, anticipated, quote, the tired businessman's conception of art, and foreshadows those more recent critics who are concerned about the extent to which mediocre artistic products lull the reader, listener, or viewer into passivity, end quote. However, the elevation of art at the expense of popular culture was by no means a uniquely German idea, although it is quite telling that those time-honored German classics in Löwenthal's reading knew well that their time was all but over. The English poet William Wordsworth, in considering the spread of popular literature in the early 19th century, arrived at the quite similar conclusion that the modern world brought forth a need for, quote, gross and violent stimulants, end quote, which, quote, tends, quote, to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind, end quote, unquote. Whereas the function of true art is to stimulate these powers. Popular literature reduces people to an attitude of passivity, or in the words of Wordsworth, to, quote, a state of almost savage torpor, end quote. Finally, Alexis de Tocqueville was even more pessimistic about this. He believed that in modern societies only mass communications could ever be successful, quote, and that they can only be products of popular culture unrelated to valid intellectual, artistic, or moral criteria, end quote. Thus, the writer of poetry, plays, and novels would in his way become, quote, just as much a manufacturer of commodities as any other businessman, end quote. Löwenthal, for his part, did not disavow the merits of popular culture straight away. Toward the end of his historical survey, he discusses the artistic possibilities of mass media. Unlike conservative critics of modern culture, he certainly was not afraid of the, quote, masses. He knew quite well that they were no indisputable fait social, but a product of advanced capitalist societies. Yet why should the vast majority of people be fobbed off with lowbrow substitutes of art for all eternity? Löwenthal never condescendingly justified the badly established division of cultures, a reflection of the social division of labor. Quote, I don't sympathize with the proletariat, end quote, he quipped. Quote, Marx didn't sympathize with the proletariat either. The proletariat was to be self-abolished. Proletarian lifestyles are hardly a model worth imitating, nor petty bourgeois lifestyles that attempt to emulate the lifestyles of the upper classes. End quote. One second, let's see if I can copy this. Doesn't look like him. Good quote. On the other hand, more strikingly, Löwenthal was not even sure about the blessing of art. With hindsight, when he turned almost 80, he said, quote, "How much indeed the great literary art of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries really accomplished, whether it changed people, that is very much yet to be decided. For ultimately, those are our ancestors and forefathers, and what, after all, has become of our society," end quote. Löwenthal. Whatever true art might be able to achieve in terms of social history, Löwenthal clearly saw that this entire tradition was about to be absorbed by the culture industry. In response to being asked if the broad access to art was to be considered progressive, he replied that this perhaps partly sincere democratic distribution of art would not include the capability of experiencing art, for the latter was being suppressed not only by the institutions of popular culture, but also by the social relations more generally. As to both popular culture and art's transformation into the culture industry, Löwenthal was most concerned about the growing loss of individual experience and thus of individual expression. Löwenthal characterized this as a process of dehumanization within a society purportedly promoting the autonomy of the individual, also contravened by the persistence of repressive collectives, communities, or clans. Communication, the main function of media, had long since assumed a reality independent from the human beings technically involved in it. This decline of language in the age of ubiquitous communication is perhaps the most striking manifestation of what Löwenthal described as a lifestyle of vicarious experience. Ironically, the so-called linguistic turn in the humanities and social sciences, boasting a soberly instrumental and decidedly, quote, anti-human conception of language, has supported this tendency. Moreover, in Löwenthal's view, the aforementioned problem of artistic standards, or rather criteria, in addition to the obvious commercial interest on the part of the producers, has likewise been affected, broiled down to the dichotomy, I like it / I don't like it. While such an attitude had already been applied to the products of popular culture, it was now applied to supposedly serious works of art as well. Even well-trained readers, listeners, and viewers of popular text, music, or any other media product could hardly be expected to believe in utopian promises anymore. The perpetual consumption of all those more or less overtly illusionary displays of happiness had left them with no illusions except for the enchanted world of everyday life, a reality that had become its own ideology. This most deceptive kind of realism inevitably affects the possibilities of art. Nevertheless, Löwenthal insisted that the difference between the prospering industry of cultural commodity production and works of art must not be relinquished. Not because art is good to would have it ought to be defended for the sake of its high standards, rather because the experience of art, however negatively, anticipates a state of things, quote, that are no longer distorted by exchange, profit, and the false needs of a degraded humanity, end quote. Löwenthal, more so than Adorno, was concerned with the reception of both art and popular culture, but unlike cultural studies, he never sought to diminish the importance of the work of art as such in favor of its supposedly very significant appropriation by manifold audiences. Much like Adorno, he associated art in a remotely messianic, though quite secular sense of the word. Much like Adorno, he associated art in a remotely messianic, the quite secular sense of the word, with redemption or reconciliation. Or in Adorno's words, quote, art is not only the plenipotentiary of a better praxis than that which has to date predominated, but is equally the critique of praxis as the rule of brutal self-preservation at the heart of the status quo and in its service. It gives the lie to products for production's sake, and opts for a form of praxis beyond the spell of labor. Art's promesse du bonheur means not only that hitherto praxis has blocked happiness, but that happiness is beyond praxis. The measure of the chasm separating praxis from happiness is taken by the force of negativity in the artwork. End quote. Adorno. New section, Authoritarianism and Anti-Semitism. Empirical research had been part of the Institute's agenda since its inception, although it was only in American exile that Horkheimer and his associates, not always entirely by their own choice, acquainted themselves with state-of-the-art methods. The most important empirical study, however, had already been undertaken in pre-Nazi Germany, conducted by Löwenthal's old friend Erich Fromm. This study of the mindset of German workers and employees was intended to find out why they were interested in anything but a proletarian revolution. But Fromm found out something else, namely that there was a subliminal inclination toward authoritarian rule, even among otherwise progressive and liberal-minded people. The result was the Arbeiter- und Angestel... Jesus Christ. Or the result of the Arbeiter- und Angestelltenvereinigung, which was not fully published until the 1980s, instantly alarmed the Institute's members and led Horkheimer to take precautions for immigration. This study saved lives, recalled Löwenthal. It was, quote, one of the few examples, although not the only one, in world history in which social research helped the social researchers themselves, end quote. Löwenthal. Henceforth, the question of authority continued to solicit the Institute's attention in various ways. Löwenthal's first study undertaken in exile was a series of theoretical reflections on the vicissitudes of authority in modern societies, which in contrast to the medieval understanding of authority and even tradition claimed to be based on reason. I fucked that up. However, the question of authority continued to solicit the Institute's attention in various ways. Löwenthal's first study, undertaken in exile, was a series of theoretical reflections on the vicissitudes of authority in modern societies, which in contrast to the medieval understanding of authority and tradition claimed to be based on reason. Even within constitutional democracies, different cultural institutions, most notably the bourgeois family, social life is governed by unquestioned, purportedly rational authorities rather than individual desires. Owing to their broad scope, though, these essays were not included in the Institute's voluminous book, Studies on Authority in the Family, published in Paris in 1936. When Löwenthal got back to this issue in the 1940s, it was on unfamiliar empirical grounds. Research into the social and psychological foundations of authoritarianism and anti-Semitism in particular kept several of the Institute's members busy during this time. Horkheimer was appointed research director of the American Jewish Committee, while Adorno, along with American colleagues, proceeded with the studies on the authoritarian personality, certainly the most famous piece of empirical work associated with the Institute. Yet another groundbreaking study was also underway. Leo Löwenthal, in collaboration with Norbert Guttermann, an émigré from France, where he had formerly been closely affiliated with Henri Lefebvre, conducted empirical research on fascist agitation in the United States. The resulting book, Prophets of Deceit, published in 1949, was soon to be widely regarded as a landmark study in political psychology. The core question is why demagogic agitators are able to attract large audiences in democratic societies, and how otherwise quite reasonable people can be won over to a fascist cause. Löwenthal and Guttermann's answer is that the agitator deliberately rejects the rules of democratic debate, revealing that they are a giant deception staged by sinister and alien. Sorry, I fucked that up. Löwenthal and Guttermann's answer is that the agitator deliberately rejects the rules of democratic debate, revealing that the rules of democratic debate are a giant deception staged by sinister and alien foreigners, communists, Jews, non-believers, bureaucrats, enemies of the honest, hard-working people. While his own revelations and insinuations rely on resentments rather than arguments, they quite often match the mood of many of his listeners, who therefore tend to embrace such an impostor as their savior. In psychoanalytic terms, this is regression, if only metaphorically. People suspend their political judgment and ultimately their own ability to think, while they eagerly submit to an imaginary father who promises to care for them. An illusion of happiness, or paradoxically, even strength, is bought is bought for the abandonment of reasoning. Just one topic will be focused on here by way of example. The agitator's constant warning of imminent catastrophes will lead his followers to vaguely hope that, quote, when the deluge comes, they too may be allowed to perform the acts that are attributed to the enemy, end quote. This is what Löwenthal, using Freudian terms, called pathic projection, a central element of his critical theory of anti-Semitism, of which more later. Additionally, quote, the explanation of everyday mischances in terms of uncanny world catastrophes revitalizes and reinforces the heritage of infantile anxieties. The unconscious finds in the agitator's interpretations a replica of his own primitive reactions to the outside world. The listener plays the role of the little child, responding to the warning that bogies may come for him. End quote. Löwenthal. Considering the numerous conspiracy theories cropping up nowadays, promoted by not only fascist and religious zealots or pseudo-religious agitators, but by various political activists, bloggers, and the like, the techniques illuminated by Löwenthal and Gutschman may still prove revealing. Moreover, as Adorno asserted back then, this kind of social psychological research on both empirical and theoretical grounds could offer an efficient antidote to the blossoming nonsense of the strictly quantitative methods usually applied to this field of study. Remarkably, Löwenthal analyzed fascist agitation in relation to the culture industry. Both could be regarded, quote, as, quote, psychoanalysis in reverse, end quote. That is, as more or less constantly manipulated devices to keep people in permanent psychic bondage, to increase and reinforce neurotic and even psychotic behavior, culminating in perpetual dependency on a, quote, leader or on institutions and products, end quote. Löwenthal was involved in another empirical research project launched by the Institute in the 1940s. Although less renowned than the book Prophets of Deceit, this study on anti-Semitism among American workers might be considered even more important today. Its results are certainly more disillusioning. Löwenthal had already experienced the attitude of young German proletarians toward an allegedly privileged Jewish intellectual firsthand, when he was drafted at the age of 18 during the First World War. Now, by means of methodologically approved social research, Löwenthal had his own personal experience empirically confirmed. The hatred for the Jew, Löwenthal found out, is the hatred for the individual, or as he later put it, quote, a perverted and suppressed form of utopia. The Jews represent something that others want to be, end quote. That is why, at times, the most relentless enemies of the Jews can at the same time be among their most fervent admirers. Anti-Semitism is longing for redemption by means of destruction, as if the imagined sinister powers of those to be killed might thus be bestowed on their assassins. Indeed, it was only in those years of the Institute, and Löwenthal in particular, gained an understanding of the specificity of anti-Semitic resentment. Parallel to his empirical studies, Löwenthal co-authored the first 3 theses on elements of anti-Semitism, a chapter in the book Dialectic of Enlightenment. At last, this is what Horkheimer and Adorno declare in the foreword to their book. However, the letters at the time, particularly the correspondence between Horkheimer and Löwenthal, suggest that the contribution of the latter went much further. The outset of the Elements of Anti-Semitism chapter states that, quote, for the fascists, the Jews are not a minority but the anti-race, the negative principle as such. On their extermination, the world's happiness depends, end quote. Therefore, anti-Semitism ought to be clearly distinguished from racism, a lesson that yet to be learned by many today. True, the Jew can easily be portrayed as a scapegoat, though a scapegoat, quote, not only for individual maneuvers and machinations, but in the wider sense that the economic injustice of the whole class is attributed to him, end quote. Löwenthal. Whatever shortcomings the elements, or I guess that quote is from Elements of Anti-Semitism chapter, but maybe that's Löwenthal who wrote that last quote. Whatever shortcomings the elements may have otherwise, the theoretical insights formulated in these theses, in Theses 1 and 3, have proven indispensable to any critical notion of anti-Semitism ever since. And there is yet another substantial one to be found in Thesis 4, where Horkheimer and Adorno suggest that, quote, Anti-Semitism is based on false projection, is the reverse of genuine mimesis, and has deep affinities to the repressed. In fact, it may itself be the pathic character trait in which the latter is precipitated. If mimesis makes itself resemble its surroundings, false projection makes its surroundings resemble itself. End quote. Dialectic of Enlightenment. But this notion of pathic projection had probably been brought up by Löwenthal in preceding discussions with Horkheimer and Adorno. Quote, I think we should add a paragraph on projection to the, quote, Thesen, unquote, which I guess is theses plural in German. Horkheimer wrote to Adorno in English, quote, after all, the projection of aggression or destruction is the most obvious psychological fact of anti-Semitism. ... Would I be asking too much if I begged you to jot down the notes on projection which you made on the Sunday afternoon before I left? End quote. Horkheimer. One more thing seems worth mentioning here. In 1946, a couple of years before Hannah Arendt came up with her voluminous study, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Löwenthal published an article on the devastating functions and dehumanizing effects of terror, covering both National Socialism and Stalinism. Apart from many crucial insights into the very specific rationality of terror as a means of social domination, this titled treatise points out an aspect that may be of interest on a more general level. Löwenthal observes the collapse of continuous experience, which terrorist rule purposefully precipitates. Löwenthal observes the collapse of continuous experience, which terrorist rule purposefully precipitates, but which, inadvertently, and to a much lesser effect, of course, is about to strike people's lives under the rather comfortable conditions provided by orderly democratic countries. Biographies are quite literally falling apart. Perhaps one of the reasons why the biographic genre had become so popular in books and films. Second. Sorry, that's so good. New section. Postmodern times. In his old age, Löwenthal received several honors and awards from his native country. Belated recognition, perhaps, yet certainly a welcome opportunity for him to address a familiar foreign audience in his mother tongue. From a distant point of view, however, it seems as if those honors, irrespective of the good intentions of those in charge, were also intended to say that Germany had irrevocably overcome its sinister past, and that critical theory could therefore come to a close. Indeed, this kind of theory by then looked somewhat, quote, traditional in its own fashion. In the 1980s, after a decade of steady decline, social criticism originating from the works of Hegel, Marx, and Freud was virtually over and done with. The Frankfurt School's, quote, second generation, as it came to be called, basically formed and most famously represented by Jürgen Habermas, had not only diminished the significance of both Freudian psychoanalysis and the Marxian critique of political economy, but likewise stripped away their founding fathers' ill-reputed negativity. Most notoriously, Adorno's intransigent attitude toward a, quote, wrong society was to be replaced by a rather conciliatory theory of communication and thus an inevitably quixotic ethics of discourse placed well beyond the relations of production. According to Habermas, history, instead of keeping us under its spell, was finally loosening its grip on societies and individuals alike. Of course, the legacy of Horkheimer's critical theory had not and still has not been fully eclipsed. One might think of, for instance, disparate authors such as Rolf Tiedemann, Detlef Clausen, Wolfgang Port in Germany, or Moishe Pastone and Martin Jay in the United States. Nevertheless, an even greater challenge than Habermas's attempted rescue of modern rationality was being posed by the postmodern farewell to reason, history, and reality. Löwenthal, unperturbed by colorful intellectual trends and at the same time acutely alert to the complacent talk of post-histoire. Histoire? I don't know if that's post-history. I don't know. In his last years, seized several occasions to breast this wave that was about to wash away the conceptual foundations of critical theory and enlightenment altogether. Perhaps the most appropriate and personally rewarding occasion was the reception of the Theodor W. Adorno Award in his native city of Frankfurt in 1889. The speech he delivered then might be regarded as his legacy on behalf of, as well as his deceased friends. Löwenthal said he was there to bear witness to the intellectual and moral motives of critical theory. The award, therefore, ought to belong to the entire group. Incidentally, this was shortly before the fall of the Berlin Wall inaugurated the collapse of state socialist rule in Central and Eastern Europe. Thus, the remains of the revolution, which in Löwenthal's words had long since abandoned him and his associates, were to be removed from history once and for all. But by then, the idea of history he had been keeping up against all odds, particularly of a history yet to come, had already been called into question by others, most prominently by former Western Marxists or renegade Leninists and Maoists, who from an almost religious level of dogmatic belief in history taking its course for the good of humanity, had meanwhile arrived at quite the opposite point of view. Yeah, so for example, I don't know, there's a bunch of people, in the extreme example probably would be Andre Glucksmann, who was like a Maoist, and then became one of the new philosophes in France. But anyway, history, for all its catastrophic failures and its obvious senselessness, now appeared to them as mere conglomeration of contingent events, if not as an illusion just as society or reality. Jean Baudrillard's theory of simulacra and the simulation of reality probably reached the very peak of this overall intellectual tendency. The Marxian critique of the apparition of reality, that is, a socially produced and socially, not solely technically, mediated reality, was thereby turned into a cynical denial of reality as such, allegedly indistinguishable from its own simulation. Consequently, any possible change of social reality was to be considered equally illusory, and social criticism was exposed to ridicule, quote, a travesty of what Adorno meant by his notion of damaged life, end quote. I don't know if that quote's from Löwenthal or not. But beyond this perhaps most flamboyant display of postmodernism, which soon disappeared, there were arguably some more serious contenders. Under the influence of French post-structuralism, many notions pertinent to critical theory were now being reviewed from a different point of view and to different ends, for example, the category of the subject. Starting with Roland Barthes' essay, Death of the Author, and Michel Foucault's famous saying, quote, the man would be erased like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea, end quote. It had become fashionable, if not obligatory, at least in many departments of the so-called humanities, to disclose the human subject as a discursive construction. In contrast, Goethe, Löwenthal recalled, had already turned against a false subjectivity, but of course he never intended to abolish the subject, but to elevate the subject in a dialectical sense. This too is what critical theory always had in mind. Quote, we did not have to attend a postmodern salon to learn about the problematic notion and ideology of the individual, end quote. Löwenthal remarked, the much noticed fragility of the subject, Löwenthal remarked, was intended to indicate its expendability in present societies. Yet at the same time, while dismissing the subject as fiction, the postmodernist discourse itself indulges in a, quote, orgy of subjectivism, end quote. If literally anything goes as well as anything else, no one can tell the difference between a Manhattan phone phone directory and a tragedy of Shakespeare. It goes without saying that, from this declaredly pluralistic, actually downright relativistic position, art cannot be reasonably distinguished from the products of the culture industry, nor even from any other phenomenon. What initiated as a kind of reissue of Montaignian skepticism, though more meddlesome and less smartly written, amounted to a, quote, triumph. What initiated as a kind of reissue of Montaignian skepticism, though more meddlesome and less smartly written, amounted to a, quote, triumph of instrumental relativism, end quote. Even worse, Löwenthal suspected, the, quote, monstrosity of post-histoire. And again, I'm guessing it's post-history. If it does mean anything at all, would entail a refusal of the Jewish messianic heritage and of any utopian hope, however difficult these notions might have become. Although hardly ever read, Löwenthal's distant early writings are echoing even louder today, since, quote, deconstruction, as he called it, probably the most influential, quote, spawn of postmodernism, end quote, now provides the major source of theory even for those devoted to social criticism. If they are not just grappling with cultures and identities, then notions such as class or the exchange of commodities are remodeled in terms of discourse. Quote, universalism, for example, has become a term of abuse, whereas any kind of autochthonous barbarism might be glorified as an act of resistance to a modernity summarily equated to Western capitalism. Apparently, the dismissal of Enlightenment categories, traditionally a raging passion of reactionary critics of Western civilization, has in only slightly different terms been embraced by those who, according to that same tradition, would be considered liberals or left-wingers. But maybe this tradition has come to an end. It is quite telling that nowadays, with critical theory widely being treated as a dead dog, as Marx would have it, the works of Walter Benjamin have gained an almost obtrusive popularity, though mostly owing to, quote, readings informed by post-structuralist philology. This is why Benjamin can now as easily be linked to Martin Heidegger and Carl Schmitt as to Marx or the Messiah. In this respect, at least, Löwenthal could consider himself lucky, since virtually no one is reading his writings anymore. Indeed, quote, the overshadowing vogue of deconstruction, quote, says Robert Helot Kenter, quote, has done inestimable damage to critical thought, end quote, although the real degree of this damage remains to be seen. As for the United States, where Löwenthal spent most of his life after being exiled from Germany, Helot Kenter notes that, quote, academia's contribution to a nation always wanting to get things done as with hammer and saw, rather than by invoking intellect, was to provide reading to dislodge interpretation. Reading to dislodge interpretation. Rewriting to take the place of conceptualization. Rewriting to take the place of conceptualization. And the handy toughness profiled in any announced deconstruction to easily trump weak-willed critique and the fragile mentalism of insight. The fragile mentalism of insight, end quote. Helot Kenter. In his very first essay written in 1920 entitled The Demonic Draft of a Negative Philosophy of Religion, The Demonic, subtitle, Draft of a Negative Philosophy of Religion, Löwenthal went through various demonologies worrying mankind in this disastrously enchanted world. Only the bright messianic light would ultimately doom them all. The questions they kept asking would then be answered. For the time being, however, it would be helpful to ask the right questions. And that's the end of this chapter. I'm going to now look through the endnotes to see if there's anything worth reading here. And again, I don't know what these are referenced to, because I can't, this is a bad PDF, so I have to use like a weird program to even look at it. Provisions for this imminent case had been made since 1931. The first destination was Switzerland, yet Horkheimer and his associates were not given the opportunity to settle down. While still pondering the prospects of going to Paris or London, they received a generous offer from Columbia University in New York, which they eventually accepted. It looks like there's a list of like English tradition translations of Löwenthal's work. It says an English version of this edition, except for Volume 5, containing Löwenthal's early writings, was subsequently published under the title Communications in Society. Volume 1 was titled Literature and Mass Culture, published in 1984. Volume 2, Literature and the Image of Man, published in 1986. Volume 3, False Prophets, Studies on Authoritarianism, published in 1987. And Volume 4, Critical Theory and Frankfurt Theorists, Lectures, Correspondence, Conversations. And footnote. That's why a first attempt on the history of the Institute, Martin Jay's book Dialectical Imagination of 1973, was taken in the United States under the tutelage of Leo Löwenthal, who provided Jay with personal documents. And footnote. Back in 1946, Löwenthal confided to Horkheimer, quote, I consider it utterly more important to stress today the differences with the party, bracket, i.e. the Communist Party, in bracket, than those with the liberals, end quote. But Horkheimer was not yet convinced. See his letter to Löwenthal from September 24th, 1946. End footnote. Sorry, moving through this. Footnote. Authors such as Emil Ludwig and Stefan Zweig, the subjects of Löwenthal's early studies, had won international fame with their pleasing portrayals of renowned artists and statesmen, but since Löwenthal did not intend to embarrass these celebrated Jewish émigrés, he withheld the publication of his articles until the collapse of Nazi rule. And footnote. Interestingly, almost at the same time in the early 1960s, Jürgen Habermas explored the historical vicissitudes of the public sphere, what Löwenthal did not know then apparently. His interest was different and more specific anyway. Unlike Habermas, he sought to grasp the intellectual development of mass culture, not the political formation of a genuinely bourgeois public sphere. End footnote. Let's see. Footnote. Remarkably, Löwenthal, at least in public, never criticized Habermas's revision of critical theory. End footnote. Footnote. To be sure, Habermas, as a public intellectual, often fervently interfered in controversies about recent German history in particular, whereas his purportedly growing theoretical understanding of Western democratic societies might lead readers to believe that, quote, there has been history, but there is no longer any, end quote. Marx, Poverty of Philosophy. Some decades before, interestingly, Horkheimer had suspected Habermas of adolescent revolutionism without much thinking about history the other way, meaning what separates post-Nazi Germany from the days of the early Marx. See his letter to Adorno from September 27, 1958 in Theodor W. Adorno and Max Horkheimer, Briefwechsel, Volume 4, pages 1950 to 1969. End footnote. Footnote. As early as 1983, in the article Caliban's Legacy, Löwenthal criticized the anti-historicism of structuralist and post-structuralist thought. Okay, and that's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.